So I'm a disabled gamer. I can only play video games with my left hand due to a very bad carpal tunnel syndrome in my right hand. And I initially looked into trying to use joysticks like this as a left-handed game controller. But I found that their ergonomics were awful, and it turns out that the standard controller that we all know and love, the DualShock and Xbox controllers, work pretty well with one hand if you set them up right. And that's what I'm going to go into detail in here. So perhaps surprisingly, if you have only one hand to play video games with, it actually helps to have two controllers. And that's what I'm doing here. So the idea is that you can touch any joystick and be able to reach the other buttons. So for instance, if I want to move around with this joystick, I can still push any of these four buttons over on this side. Or if I need to look and push buttons, I can use my hand like this. And by having two joysticks, it's possible to use remapping software. In this case, I strongly recommend reWASD because it allows you to map two joysticks into one to be able to make some buttons toggle so that you don't have to awkwardly try to hold down a button while you're moving the joysticks. So for instance, in Death Stranding, you often need to hold down the trigger buttons while you're moving in order to not drop your load. And that's very difficult to do with one hand, especially if you want to hold down both trigger buttons. But what you can do is you can set up some of the extra buttons that you have because you have two controllers like this as toggle buttons. So in Death Stranding, the idea is you have to use these trigger buttons here. Those are very hard to get to if you're going to set your joysticks on a surface like this. So what I like to do is I map these, I don't know what these are called, action buttons we'll call, as trigger buttons because it doesn't actually matter in most games whether or not you have a range to pull the trigger button down. It's really just a is it depressed or not option. So I map these two buttons here as the left and right trigger buttons, and when I push it once, it becomes held down, and when I push it again, it releases it. So that makes it possible to grab a hold of your load in Death Stranding when you're going to do something crazy. Just push those two buttons, and then you can move around with this button, or excuse me, joystick, and you can look with this joystick. And then when you're ready to let go, you can just go ahead and push these two buttons. So another aspect of this setup that's very important is to be able to have the joysticks lay still without holding on to them. And so what I've got here is a setup. This is not my normal gaming setup. I needed something a little neater for recording a video. But basically you have a slanted board, and then you use some of this kitchen fabric that's meant to keep your dishes from sliding around inside your cupboards. That actually holds the gamepad very well, as you can see, and having it on a little bit of a slope makes the ergonomics very reasonable. And so now it's possible to move with the standard joystick and look with the other joystick simultaneously. And I'm not going to show you that because I think watching someone play a video game where most of the image is the controller is kind of boring, but you get the idea. So it is possible to control the joysticks this way simultaneously with just one hand. For another example of why having two joysticks is really great, in Death Stranding, sometimes you need to hold down the D-pad while you're selecting things in a menu. And sometimes you don't want to hold down the D-pad, sometimes you just want to tap it. So I map this particular D-pad to be normal, and I map this one to be hold and press. So in other words, if I push this D-pad like that, it acts like the D-pad is held down in that direction until I tap it again. Having the ability to map two joysticks into one is actually a killer feature for someone who's disabled, because now you can have buttons that toggle on and off, and you can have buttons that are instantaneous release when you need them. And the other great thing about this is, although it's possible to sort of come up with fancy controller mappings on a game-by-game basis, you can actually just sort of have a generic set where you map your controllers so that this one is a standard controller in every single way, and then this one basically has toggle buttons for the features that you want to be able to hold the button down while you're playing. So I strongly recommend this approach. It's really a cheap one too, because you can just grab two controllers. They can't be identical. They need to be slightly different, so it's easy to individuate them in reWASD. But as long as you have two basically identical controllers with different hardware IDs, you can combine them into one in that software, and then you can make it so that they act as a single controller, but you basically have twice as many inputs to work with. So I have found that to be relatively successful for games like Death Stranding, pretty much any walking simulator ever invented. It's not so great for like a first-person shooter, but you have to sort of set your expectations appropriately, right? Not every single game is going to be friendly for the disabled player, but with a setup like this, you can drastically increase the number of titles that you can successfully use. So if people are interested, I can go into a video where I actually demo how to set this up in reWASD. It's a fairly complex piece of software, and I think it would be necessarily a little bit of a challenge to use because of its complexity no matter what. But the interface is really, really challenging. And if people need help, I can sort of do a little tutorial on how to do this. But fusing two joysticks together and then making some of the buttons toggle is probably the easiest thing to do in reWASD. In any case, I'm really curious to hear what people think about this setup and suggestion. And, if anyone wants to share their improvements that they've come across in trying to achieve the same solution to the problem of only being able to use one hand while playing video games, I'm also all ears. Because actually the idea of using a standard controller was something that one of my viewers suggested. I started out this journey with trying to use these, controllers that were meant for one hand, and it was just a miserable, miserable experience. And someone suggested, well, why don't you use just a controller flat on a surface? And that was a big improvement for me. And then I realized, hey, two controllers could be a game changer, and it really is. So, together as a community, maybe we can make video games more accessible for disabled folks like ourselves without relying on the developers themselves to do the hard work. In any case, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing your comments.